There is a specific kind of person who feels too much, who walks into a room and immediately knows how every person in it is feeling, who absorbs the emotional state of others as if there were no membrane between their psyche and the surrounding field, who is capable of a depth of understanding and presence with other people's suffering that those around them frequently describe as extraordinary. This person is called, in contemporary language, an empath. And the content niche that has formed around this identity over recent decades is one of the largest and most loyal in the psychology and spirituality space. There are books, podcasts, communities, personality tests, and entire certification programs built around the idea that some people are fundamentally more sensitive than others, and that this sensitivity is, in its essence, a gift. Jung did not use the term empath. He spoke of psychological types of the feeling function of people with a particular psychic permeability to the collective emotional field. But he would immediately understand what is being described, and he would add something that most content about empathy and hypersensitivity consistently omits. Something that is, in the Jungian perspective, not a detail, but the central point. Hypersensitivity, like any sufficiently developed psychological quality, has a shadow. And that shadow is all the denser the more completely the person identifies with the empath identity as their defining and most valuable characteristic. The counterintuitive turn that Jung offers to the theme of hypersensitivity is this. The problem is not that the person feels too much. The problem is what they do with what they feel, and what they cannot see about themselves precisely because of how much they feel. The person who identifies completely with empathy as their central characteristic has, in general, a shadow organized around everything the empath narrative cannot include. The anger, the judgment, the desire for attention, the manipulation through sensitivity, the power that vulnerability confers, the specific way in which care for others can be a strategy of control over them. None of these contents are compatible with the identity of a person who simply feels too much and suffers for it. And so, all of them go into the shadow. This video is not an attack on the real experience of hypersensitivity, which is real, has identifiable neurological foundations, and produces a genuinely different way of being in the world that deserves to be understood and respected. It is an invitation for the empath to take seriously something that most content on the topic systematically avoids. The idea that the empath identity can be, simultaneously, a genuine description of a real characteristic and a sophisticated way of avoiding the encounter with the dimensions of the self that do not fit that description. And that the work of integrating the empath's shadow is, paradoxically, what transforms hypersensitivity from burden into genuine resource. Before entering the empath's shadow, it is necessary to establish with precision what hypersensitivity actually is, because the confusion between what is a genuine characteristic and what is an identity construction around that characteristic is itself part of the problem.
Genuine hypersensitivity, which researchers Elaine Aron and others have documented under the term highly sensitive person, is a real neurological characteristic present in approximately 15 to 20% of the population that manifests as deeper and more elaborate sensory and emotional processing than average.
People with this characteristic take longer to process experiences, are more deeply affected by subtle stimuli, have a rich inner life, and are often more affected by art, music, beauty, and the suffering of others than their peers. Jung would describe hypersensitivity as a specific configuration of the feeling function, the psychological function responsible for value evaluation, relational connection, and perception of the emotional field. In people with this configuration, the feeling function operates with an amplitude and depth that can be, in appropriate contexts, extraordinarily valuable. As the capacity to create genuine connection, to perceive relational nuances that others miss, to offer presence with others' suffering in a way that few people can. The problem begins not with the characteristic itself, but with the relationship the person develops with it, and especially with the way it becomes the center of an identity that, like all identities, needs to be defended, confirmed, and protected from everything that contradicts it. Picture a specific scene, a work meeting where a decision is made that affects the team. The hypersensitive person in the room immediately perceives the unspoken tension of one colleague, the anxiety disguised as composure in another, the genuine relief behind the neutral expression of a third. She processes all of this in parallel with the meeting's content and leaves the room with a richness of emotional information that most of those present simply did not register. That is the real capacity. But she also leaves exhausted in a way no one around her understands, with an emotional information overload that takes hours to process, and with a sense of responsibility for the emotional state of everyone in the room that no one asked her to carry. The capacity and the cost are inseparable, and understanding both is the honest starting point. The distinction Jung would make between hypersensitivity as a characteristic and the empath identity as a construction is crucial and concrete enough to feel. Imagine two people with the same degree of genuine sensitivity. One has developed her sensitivity as a capacity, something she has and uses, that she can turn toward or away from depending on context. The other has built an identity around it. She is the empath, the one who feels what others cannot, the one whose sensitivity defines her value and her role in every relationship. Both have the same characteristic, but the second is now using her sensitivity to maintain a story about herself. And the story, once established, begins filtering experience in ways that confirm and reinforce itself. What that filtering excludes is precisely what needs to be found. And it is what the empath's shadow holds. Every identity creates a shadow. Jung was absolutely clear about this. The shadow is not formed only by qualities that were explicitly rejected or punished. It is formed by everything that is incompatible with the identity that was constructed as central and valuable, and the empath identity, which organizes itself around sensitivity, care, the capacity to feel what others feel, openness to others' suffering, excludes by definition a specific set of contents that are incompatible with this self-image. These contents do not disappear. They go into the shadow, where they continue operating in ways the empath frequently cannot see because they are so completely outside the field of what is possible to be, given who they believe themselves to be. The first content of the empath's shadow is anger. The empath narrative, especially in its more popular versions, tends to present hypersensitivity as a form of openness and vulnerability that is the opposite of anger. The empath feels, suffers, absorbs, but not anger, because anger is perceived as incompatible with sensitivity. What happens with the anger that inevitably arises, faced with people who take advantage of the empath's generosity, with environments that exhaust without reciprocity, with relationships that consistently take more than they give, is that it is converted into excessive understanding of the person who hurt them, into self-blame for their own exhaustion, into a diagnosis of the other as narcissistic or energetically toxic. Anything that avoids the simple and direct recognition that the empath is furious and has legitimate reasons to be. The counterintuitive turn about the empath's shadow is this: the judgment that the empath believes they do not have, because the empath narrative organizes itself around understanding and non-judgment, is frequently more intense and more inflexible than the judgment of the people they consider less sensitive. The difference is that it operates in the shadow, disguised. The empath who says they do not judge frequently divides the world, with great precision and considerable rigidity, between people who feel and people who do not, between those with emotional depth and those who are superficial, between those who deserve their openness and those who do not. This judgment is real, it is sophisticated, and it is exactly the kind of thing the empath identity cannot openly admit. There is a third content of the empath shadow that is perhaps the most difficult to name, and the most important: power. Hypersensitivity, when it functions as a central identity, confers a specific relational power that is rarely recognized as such. The empath knows what others are feeling before they themselves know. Knows when someone is lying, when they are uncomfortable, when they are afraid. This information is power, and it is used frequently in completely unconscious ways to navigate relationships in ways the empath would not recognize as manipulation, but that, examined honestly, have the structure of manipulation. The strategic vulnerability that produces care, the displayed sensitivity that creates obligation, the communicated suffering that regulates others' behavior. None of these patterns are intentional, but none of them are accidental. One of the most discussed aspects of the empath experience is emotional absorption, the feeling of absorbing the emotional state of those nearby in a way that makes it difficult to distinguish what is yours from what belongs to the other. This experience is real. Neuroscience has identified specific mechanisms, including the differentiated functioning of mirror neurons, that explain why some people are more permeable to others' emotional fields than others, and the suffering that absorption can produce, the exhaustion of being in emotionally charged environments, the difficulty of maintaining clear boundaries between one's own experience and the experience of others, is genuine and deserves to be taken seriously. But Jung would add a question that most content about emotional absorption does not ask. What is the function of the absorption? What does it serve? Because in Jungian psychology, the unconscious does not produce patterns without reason. Every pattern, however costly, is serving something. And emotional absorption, when examined honestly, frequently serves more than simply receiving what is in the environment. It serves control, the capacity to know what others are feeling before they express it, to always be one emotional step ahead, to never be surprised by another state because that state has already been absorbed and processed before being declared. This control is not malicious. It is anxious. It is the strategy of someone who learned very early that not knowing what others were feeling was dangerous. Picture a specific scene: a hypersensitive person in an intimate relationship who continuously absorbs her partner's emotional state, who knows before he does that he is frustrated, who anticipates the difficult conversation and initiates it herself to have control over how it unfolds, who reads the subtle signals of distancing and acts immediately to reconnect before the distancing becomes explicit. From her perspective, she is being attentive, present, attuned. From the partner's perspective, if he can articulate it, which is often difficult, he never has space to arrive at his own emotions in his own time, because she always arrives first. The absorption that presents itself as care is functioning as control, and both things are simultaneously true. The shadow work at this point is not to abandon the capacity for absorption, which is real and which, when used consciously, is a genuine resource. It is to develop the capacity to ask honestly whether what is being absorbed is received information or projected anxiety, whether the feeling of knowing what the other is feeling is genuine perception or is one's own fear being attributed to the external field. This distinction between perception and projection, between absorption and anxiety, is one of the most difficult the empath can be invited to make, and it is precisely because of its difficulty that it is so rarely made. The difficulty of setting limits is perhaps the most recurring theme in content about empathy and hypersensitivity, and it is generally presented as a direct consequence of sensitivity. The empath cannot set limits because they feel too much, because the pain they would cause the other by saying no is perceived more intensely than the pain they cause themselves by saying yes. This explanation has truth, but it is incomplete, and the missing part is precisely what the shadow holds. Jung would say that the difficulty of setting limits is often not just a consequence of sensitivity, it is a consequence of something the empath identity cannot admit: the need to be needed. The empath who cannot say no frequently cannot, because saying no means risking that the person on the other side will find another source of care, another point of support, another place to take their need, and that the empath will become dispensable. The openness to others' suffering, the availability that seems unlimited, the care that has no time or condition, all of this serves, among other things, to ensure that the empath remains central in the lives of the people they care for. Naming this does not deny the genuine love that is also present. It recognizes that genuine love and the need to be indispensable can coexist in the same behavioral pattern. Here is what the pattern actually looks like from the inside, at the moment it operates. A person receives a message from someone in distress, a friend, a family member, a colleague, at a moment when they are genuinely exhausted and genuinely need to rest. Something happens before the response is sent. Not a decision exactly. Something faster. A flash of discomfort at the idea of not responding immediately, followed by a narrative about being the kind of person who shows up, followed by the message that says, of course, I'm here. The empath would describe this as their natural response to someone in need. What it also is, simultaneously, without canceling the genuine care, is the avoidance of the specific anxiety that arises when they are not the person who shows up. The limit was not set not only because of sensitivity to the other's pain, it was not set because not setting it was less threatening than the question of who they would be if they did. Setting genuine limits, not the performative limits announced as spiritual practice but rarely maintained, but the real limits that sometimes disappoint, sometimes create conflict, sometimes cost a relationship, is the concrete work that integrating the empath's shadow requires. And this work is difficult precisely because it requires finding and tolerating the shadow contents that the limit is built from. The anger that justifies the limit, the self-interest the limit is serving, the power being redistributed when the empath stops being the unlimited source of care. None of these contents are compatible with the empath self-image, and it is precisely for that reason that they are so necessary. There is a narrative that has become extraordinarily prevalent in the empathy content space in recent years. The narrative of the narcissist and the empath as a polar pair, as two fundamentally opposite human types who are attracted to each other in a dynamic of exploitation and suffering. In this narrative, the empath is the victim, the being of emotional depth, openness, and care, who is consistently exploited by the narcissist, the being of emotional superficiality, egocentrism, and manipulation. The narrative is seductive, has considerable explanatory power for people who recognize themselves in it, and captures something real about certain relational dynamics. But Jung would examine it with a question the narrative does not like to receive. The question is, what is the empath receiving from the relationship with the narcissist? Because Jung did not believe in unilateral victims in relationships, he believed in psychological fields that organize around complementary needs, in which each person is receiving something from the pattern, even when what they are receiving is not what they consciously say they want. And the empath-narcissist relationship, examined without the protection of the victim narrative, frequently reveals something uncomfortable. The empath in this relationship is receiving continuous confirmation of their own superior sensitivity, is receiving the certainty that they are the person with emotional depth in contrast to the other's superficiality, is receiving a clear and valued identity that the relationship confirms with each interaction. The most important counterintuitive turn of this chapter is this. The split between empath and narcissist frequently maps the split between persona and shadow within a single psyche. The empath who identifies completely with sensitivity, care, and openness has a shadow that contains the narcissistic contents that cannot be admitted. The desire for attention, the egocentrism disguised as care, the grandiosity of being the person who feels while others do not. And by finding a partner who openly expresses these contents, the empath can keep them externalized, can relate to their own shadow projected onto the other, rather than having to integrate it in themselves. The attraction is real, the repulsion is real, and both are signals that something of one's own is being encountered in the other. This does not mean that people with genuine narcissistic traits who cause genuine harm to hypersensitive people do not exist. That dynamic exists and its impact is real. It means that the narrative that positions the empath as pure victim and the narcissist as pure aggressor deprives the empath of the only position from which genuine change is possible, the position of someone who has agency, who makes choices, and who can honestly examine what their own psychology is contributing to the patterns that repeat. The question is not what the narcissist did to me. It is what in me keeps choosing this type of relationship, and what that choice is serving. Integrating the empath's shadow does not mean stopping being sensitive. It means developing a more honest and more complete relationship with what sensitivity actually contains, including the contents the empath identity cannot admit. This work begins with what is most difficult, the willingness to suspect one's own self-image, not to destroy it, not to deny the real sensitivity that exists, but to ask the question that all genuine shadow work requires. What in me does not fit the story I tell about who I am? What do I do that the empath narrative cannot explain? Where is my sensitivity serving something that is not purely the other person's good? The transition into this work is not comfortable. It is the work that most empaths never do, precisely because the content space they inhabit consistently validates the identity instead of questioning it. But the validation, however comforting, keeps them smaller than they actually are. The first concrete step is the recovery of anger. For the empath whose shadow is loaded with converted anger, this step is frequently the most transformative and the most frightening. It means learning to recognize anger before it is converted, in the moment it arises, before the conversion system kicks in and produces the generous interpretation, the self-blame, or the diagnosis of the other. It means asking, faced with situations that should produce anger, "Am I angry?" And letting the answer be whatever it is, without immediately justifying it, without immediately converting it, without immediately evaluating it as compatible or incompatible with who they believe they are. The anger that can be felt is the anger that can be used consciously. The anger that cannot be felt is the anger that will explode or leak or become depression. Picture a practitioner who, after years of working with the empath identity, begins to notice something she had never allowed herself to notice before. That when she helps someone, part of what she feels is pleasure in the helper role itself, satisfaction with her self-image as a person of depth and care, and not only genuine interest in the other. Noticing this is uncomfortable. The temptation is to immediately reject the perception, "No, my care is genuine," or to immediately dive into self-condemnation. Genuine integration does something different. It receives the perception without either rejecting it or merging with it. It recognizes that genuine care and pleasure in the caretaker role can coexist, that the mixture does not invalidate the care, and that seeing it honestly is what allows the care to become more genuine, more about the other and less about the self-image of empath. The result of integrating the empath's shadow is not a less sensitive person. It is a person whose sensitivity is available in freer and more precise ways, who can be present with others' suffering without needing to carry that suffering, who can care without needing to be indispensable, who can feel what the other feels without losing the thread back to what they themselves feel. It is the difference between empathy as an identity that needs to be continuously confirmed, and empathy as a capacity that can be consciously chosen, consciously bounded, and consciously placed in service of something larger than one's own empath self-image. Jung believed that individuation, the process of genuinely becoming who one is, always passes through the encounter with the shadow, not because the shadow is the best of us, but because what is in the shadow is part of us, and no part of the psyche that is denied remains inert. It manifests, it operates, it produces symptoms, patterns, relationships that replicate what is being avoided. For the empath, the encounter with the shadow is especially important and especially resisted, because the empath identity frequently positions itself as already being a work of development, as already being sensitivity, depth, openness. What Jung would say is that sensitivity without shadow integration is sensitivity in service of the identity, not in service of the other. Integrated hypersensitivity, the sensitivity that has passed through the encounter with its own shadow, has a different quality from hypersensitivity as identity. It is quieter, less announced, less organized around the confirmation that it exists and that it is valuable. The person who has integrated the empath's shadow does not need to identify as an empath to access the capacity. They simply have it, available, without needing it to be continuously named and validated. And because they are not using sensitivity to maintain an identity, they can use it in freer ways, can feel what the other feels without needing to do something with that feeling, can be present without needing to be central, can care without needing to be irreplaceable. There is a paradox at the heart of the empath's shadow work that is worth naming directly. The empath who integrates the contents that the empath identity excluded, the anger, the judgment, the self-interest, the power, does not become less empathic. They become more. Because genuine empathy, the real capacity to be present with another human being's experience without projecting, without absorbing, without needing to transform it, requires an ego sufficiently present and sufficiently distinct for there to actually be two people in the encounter. The empath who loses themselves in the other is not offering genuine empathy. They are offering fusion. And fusion, however much it feels like depth, is the absence of real encounter. If you arrived at this video because you recognize yourself as a hypersensitive person, if the description of emotional absorption, the difficulty with limits, the exhaustion of existing in a world that seems to feel less than you, has the quality of something lived from the inside, then this video was not made to diminish what you are. It was made to offer what most content about empathy does not offer: the possibility that your sensitivity is even greater than you thought, that it includes dimensions the empath narrative cannot hold, that the work of integrating them will not make you less sensitive, it will make you more whole. And wholeness, in Jung's view, is always more powerful than purity.